They said I was too emotional to run the company, but what they really meant was that I was inconvenient. I was 31, the youngest executive in the firm, and the only one who still remembered how the business actually started. My father founded the company in our garage with a single client and a borrowed computer, and I grew up watching invoices spread across the kitchen table while he explained margins and risk to me like bedtime stories. When he died unexpectedly, the board stepped in fast, polite on the surface, decisive underneath. At first, they kept me close. I was given a title that sounded important and responsibilities that looked meaningful from the outside. I prepared financial models, identified inefficiencies, and warned them about unsustainable expansion into markets we could not control. Every time I raised a concern, I was thanked and ignored. When the first quarter losses appeared, they needed a reason that did not involve their own decisions. That was when they started using words like sensitive, reactive, unstable. In the emergency board meeting, I sat at the long table while men twice my age spoke about leadership temperament and emotional intelligence as if they were diagnosing a condition. They referenced my insistence on caution as fear, my objections as personal bias, my frustration as lack of professionalism. By the end of the meeting, they voted to remove me from operational control and offered a generous severance package wrapped in concern for my well-being. I walked out of the building carrying a box of personal items and the quiet understanding that they had not just removed me from the company. They had erased my voice from its future. For months, I stayed invisible. I consulted quietly for small firms under short-term contracts, rebuilding my confidence one balance sheet at a time. I watched from a distance as my former company announced aggressive growth, glossy partnerships, and record hiring. The press loved the narrative of bold leadership and fearless expansion. No one mentioned me anymore. Then the cracks started to show. A sudden resignation in accounting, delayed supplier payments, a loan restructuring buried deep in a quarterly report. I noticed patterns that others missed because I knew the company's core numbers better than anyone. The risks I had warned them about were no longer theoretical. They were happening fast and publicly. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from a private equity firm asking if I would consider an advisory role on a short-term project involving a company I knew very well. They did not name it, but the attached documents made it obvious. The firm I had been pushed out of was bleeding, and the board needed outside help without admitting failure. I accepted. Not as an employee, not as a daughter of the founder, but as an independent consultant with full access to financial records and complete decision-making authority over restructuring strategy. When I walked back into the building 6 months later, no one called me emotional. They called me necessary. The moment I signed the consulting agreement, the tone inside the company shifted. Doors that had once closed politely now stayed open a little too long. Executives who had avoided my name suddenly remembered how well we used to work together. I did not respond to the change. I focused on the numbers. Within the first week, I understood why the board had panicked. Revenue looked strong on the surface, but cash flow was unstable. Growth had been financed through short-term debt stacked on top of long-term obligations, creating pressure points that would collapse the moment investor confidence wavered. Marketing costs were triple what they should have been. 2 overseas expansions were operating at a loss that had been quietly reclassified as strategic investment. I documented everything. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the problem was not market conditions. It was leadership. The executives who had dismissed me had chased visibility over stability, headlines over fundamentals. They had ignored internal warnings and silenced anyone who questioned them. The company was not failing because it was too cautious. It was failing because it had been reckless. The board requested weekly briefings. At the first one, I presented my findings without emotion, without accusation. I spoke in projections and risk curves, showing exactly when and how the company would breach its debt covenants. The room went quiet when they realized the timeline was measured in weeks, not years. Someone asked if the situation was reversible. I told them the truth. Yes, but only if control was centralized and decisions were made quickly by someone who understood the company's original structure. They asked who I had in mind. I said my name. There was resistance, of course. They spoke about optics, about stakeholder reactions, about whether bringing me back into leadership would look like an admission of past mistakes. I reminded them that bankruptcy would look worse. I also reminded them that my contract allowed me to withdraw at any time if my recommendations were not followed. By the end of the meeting, they voted to grant me interim operational authority. Quietly. No press release.
No announcement.
Officially, I was still just a consultant. Unofficially, every major decision now crossed my desk. I froze non-essential spending, renegotiated supplier contracts, and halted the most dangerous expansion projects. I replaced 2 department heads within 10 days. Some people resisted.
Others were relieved. As the numbers stabilized, something else happened.
Employees started coming to me with information they had been afraid to share before. Internal reports that had never reached the board. Emails that documented ignored warnings. Budget approvals pushed through without review. A pattern of deliberate misrepresentation emerged, not illegal, but deeply unethical. I archived everything, because I was no longer just fixing the company. I was building a record. One evening, as I reviewed an old strategic plan written by my father, I realized something that shifted my perspective completely. The board did not just want me to save the company. They wanted me to do it without exposing how badly they had failed. And for the first time since I had been forced out, I understood my real leverage. They needed my silence, and I was no longer willing to give it away for free. As the company stabilized, the board grew comfortable again, and comfort always made people careless. Cash flow improved, suppliers returned, and the looming breach of debt covenants quietly disappeared from the projections. The same executives who had once questioned my competence began to speak about our recovery in meetings, careful not to mention who had engineered it. They assumed the crisis had passed and that I would step away once my contract ended. That was their mistake. During the recovery phase, I continued auditing every layer of the company. I reviewed historical decisions, approval chains, and compensation structures that had been hidden behind complex reporting. What emerged was not a single act of incompetence, but a system designed to reward short-term optics at the expense of long-term health. Bonuses tied to expansion targets. Consulting agreements routed through personal connections. Performance metrics adjusted after the fact to justify payouts. None of it was illegal on its own. Together, it was damning. I prepared 2 versions of the future. The first was the one the board expected. A quiet transition back to the existing leadership, a public narrative of resilience, and my eventual departure with a polite acknowledgement of my contribution. The second version was the one I built in parallel. A governance overhaul triggered by investor concern, a leadership review initiated by an external firm, and a formal vote that would legally remove the executives responsible for the crisis. To activate the second version, I needed leverage beyond my contract. I found it in the shareholders. Several minority investors had grown uneasy during the crisis, but lacked clear evidence to challenge the board. I requested meetings under the pretext of alignment briefings and showed them sanitized projections first. Then I showed them what the numbers had looked like before my intervention, and how close the company had come to collapse. I did not assign blame. I let the data speak. By the end of those meetings, the question was no longer whether leadership had failed. It was why no one had been held accountable. The turning point came when an annual investors' conference was scheduled earlier than expected. The board planned to present the recovery as proof of their competence. They invited me to attend, assuming I would reinforce their narrative. Instead, I submitted a request to present a segment on risk mitigation and governance lessons learned. They approved it without reading the details. On the stage, in front of analysts, funds, and industry press, I walked through the crisis timeline. I explained the risks the company had faced and the corrective measures taken. Then I did something subtle but irreversible. I displayed decision matrices that showed which recommendations had been ignored before the crisis and who had overruled them. Names appeared on the screen. The room shifted. I did not accuse anyone. I simply stated that sustainable recovery required structural accountability and announced that an independent leadership review had been formally requested by shareholders representing a significant ownership block. The board members realized what was happening at the same moment the audience did. Control was no longer theirs. That evening, I received a message from the chair of the board asking for an urgent private meeting. He wrote that we needed to discuss next steps and reminded me of my contractual obligations. I replied with a single line: "My obligations are to the company's future, not to your comfort." The vote was scheduled for the following week. And for the first time, my return was no longer temporary. It was inevitable. The vote took place in a room that felt smaller than it used to, not because the space had changed, but because power had. The same board members who once spoke over me now avoided my eyes. The independent review firm presented its findings with clinical precision, outlining governance failures, risk suppression, and compensation practices that had encouraged reckless expansion.
No emotion, no commentary.
Just evidence. When the chair called for the vote, there was no debate. 3 directors resigned before the ballots were counted. 2 were formally removed. The remaining members approved a full leadership reset and asked me to step in as interim chief executive officer with a clear mandate to rebuild trust, restructure governance, and prepare the company for long-term stability. This time, there was no secrecy. The press release went out that afternoon. It named me as CEO and framed the decision as a return to foundational leadership principles. Analysts called it a strategic correction. Employees called it justice. The media, which once described me as overly emotional, now praised my restraint and precision under pressure. I read the articles without satisfaction. What mattered happened inside the company. I rewrote incentive structures so bonuses rewarded sustainability, not spectacle. I separated oversight from operations and installed independent risk committees. I terminated consulting agreements that existed only to protect relationships. For the first time in years, people were encouraged to question decisions instead of defending them. Some executives left. Others stayed and adapted. Within a year, the company returned to profitability without expansion headlines or dramatic announcements. Investors regained confidence. Employees stopped whispering. The culture shifted from performative certainty to measured accountability. One afternoon, I found the original mission statement my father had written by hand, folded into an old file. It spoke about responsibility, transparency, and building something that could survive its founders. I framed it and placed it in the executive conference room, not as a symbol of legacy, but as a reminder of purpose. The board chair, who had once removed me, asked for a meeting before his final departure. He apologized, not emotionally, but honestly. He said they had mistaken composure for strength and underestimated the cost of silencing dissent. I accepted the apology and let him go. I did not need vindication. Months later, I stood on the same stage where I had once been escorted out of the building, this time addressing employees as their CEO. I spoke about mistakes, about learning, and about why leadership was not about being fearless, but about being responsible when fear was justified. No one called me emotional anymore. They called me prepared. And the company finally was too.
The end.